Hey everyone. So this video is another response to Epydemic. This time we're talking about the problem of hiddenness. For those who don't know, the problem of hiddenness argues that because God wants us to form a relationship with him, and a prerequisite for having a relationship with God is to believe that he exists, then the fact that people don't believe in God is actually evidence that he doesn't exist. So, I've summarised Epydemic's rebuttal to the problem of hiddenness into 4 main points, and I'm just going to go through each one and talk about why I don't think that they work. Firstly, Epydemic argues that non-believers often have outlandish standards of evidence, and that God isn't obligated to provide anything but a reasonable standard, and Epydemic believes that God has in fact provided a reasonable standard of evidence for his existence. I have a few problems with this point. Firstly, there's really no way of objectively figuring out what a reasonable standard of evidence is. What I consider as a reasonable standard of evidence may be different to what other people would consider as a reasonable standard of evidence. And I can't figure out a way of deciding who has the right definition of a reasonable standard of evidence. What this means is that we could have any level of evidence for God, and Epydemic could just label that level of evidence reasonable. And anyone who wants more evidence than that is just being irrational. But, to solve this problem, let's offer a definition of a reasonable standard of evidence that hopefully both me and Epydemic can agree with. How about a reasonable standard of evidence is any level of evidence that any rational, well-informed, intelligent person would accept. So if we go with that definition of reasonable standard of evidence, the question becomes, does there in fact exist a rational, intelligent, well-informed person who doesn't in fact believe in God? I would argue that there does in fact exist such a person. Many in fact. Not to be modest, but I actually consider myself such a person. So unless Epydemic wants to maintain that there aren't in fact any intelligent, rational, well-informed people who don't believe in God, the problem here might deserve a bit more thought. The second thing I just think is a bit interesting is he says that God is not obligated to provide more than a reasonable standard of evidence for his existence. Now I think that things like obligation are completely subjective and societally based, much like morality. So I don't know how we could rationally decide whether or not God is obligated to do something. But my point is not whether or not God is obligated to provide a reasonable standard of evidence. My point is, God should want to provide as much evidence as necessary for people to believe. God wants people to have a relationship with him. So he should want to do anything within his power to ensure that every human being does in fact form a relationship with him. It's not a question of obligation. God should want to provide as much evidence as is necessary. Okay, so the second point that Epydemic argues is that if God forced everyone to believe that he exists, that would violate free will. Once again, I'm not really sure if free will exists or not, so using free will as a defense is a bit but let's assume free will does exist. Does God forcing me to believe that he exists violate free will? Now keep in mind, by God forcing me to believe in him, he's not forcing me to have a relationship with him. I still have the free will to completely reject him after I am sure that he exists, much like Lucifer and the rest of the fallen angels did. Free will is about choosing which actions to do, not which beliefs to believe. I can't consciously decide to think that 2 + 2 = 5. Constraints on our abilities don't limit free choice. I have to obey the laws of physics, right? God forcing me to obey the laws of physics is no more violating my free will than God making me believe certain things. In fact, if anything, God giving me knowledge is increasing my free will, because it gives me an informed decision. Epydemic's third point is that there's so much evidence for God that people spontaneously develop religious ideas. Now this is completely observable and is scientifically accepted. Now I would actually argue that these kind of spontaneous religious ideas are an example of the non-optimization of the human brain, much like blind spots are in the eye, and is actually evidence of a non-intelligent designer. I know Epydemic believes in evolution, but my point is that I don't know why God would use a method to create us that involved stuff like blind spots in eyes and not fully rational brains. The obvious problem with this, though, is that the type of religious ideas that people generate, that Epydemic is talking about, aren't compatible with Christianity. These people who generate religious ideas without being told are infidels. They're the people that in the Old Testament it tells you to kill. They're the people who don't get into heaven because they don't go through Jesus. And you can argue for some kind of third place in between heaven and hell, even though you don't have any biblical evidence. But the point is, these people who spontaneously generate religious ideas aren't going to form a relationship with God because they don't know about the whole Jesus sacrifice thing. And they're not going to get into heaven. So it's not really much point. Now, Epydemic's fourth point is that no one who genuinely seeks God will not find him before they die. My problem with this is that it's basically unfalsifiable. Let's take me for another example. I might not say I'm seeking God, but I am honestly seeking the correct answer to the question, does God exist? And if it turns out God does exist, I would want to have a relationship with him. That would be pretty cool. So if that counts as seeking God, then I'm seeking God. Let's say I get hit by a bus tomorrow, right? You have to conclude one of three things. Either I somehow converted to Christianity in between now and being hit by the bus, or I wasn't genuinely seeking God. There's nothing that I can think of that I could do for you that would show you that I'm genuinely seeking God. How do you figure out who's genuinely seeking God and who's not? And if you can't figure out which one, then how can you even make the claim that no one who's genuinely seeking God will not find him before they die, when you can't even tell who's genuinely seeking God and who's genuinely not seeking God? Do you get what I'm saying? I'm sorry, I'm not that good with the talking. Nah. Okay, that's really all I can think of to say about this. I hope you enjoyed my rebuttal to Epydemic's rebuttal to the problem of hiddenness. I just remembered that Epydemic argues that there are several deductive arguments that prove the existence of God, and he mentions the moral argument. And the next video I plan to make regarding Epydemic is a big, long response to basically every video he has made on the moral argument for God, and I'm gonna be like talking about objective morality and yeah. And that'll probably take me a while to make, because as I said, I'm not responding just to one video, I'm responding to like dozens. They're all excellent videos that Epydemic has made. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, I will be making, and I will shortly be uploading videos that don't have to do with Epydemic, so that'll also be fun. Okay, cool, that's pretty much it. Have a good day, guys. I hope that you are happy